I wrote Boxen with this other guy named John Barnett. He's not here today, but he definitely deserves a shout out. We did this all at GitHub. They were real gracious to let us spend a lot of time working on this, project, and especially a lot of the work that we had to do to make it open source. So I want to start talking today about the idea of inventing on principle. Some of you might have seen this talk before. It's a talk given by a guy named Britt Victor. And it's actually amazing. You should watch it if you get a chance. He demoed a lot of really cool ideas. And the whole idea is, again, like throwing out your preconceptions and whatever notions you have about how things work now, and think about how things could work if you just removed all of that, right? And started right back at the beginning. So I had to ask myself, what in the hell is my principle? That's a really hard question. If you need to have one small phrase that sort of defines everything that you're trying to do, it's hard to narrow that down. So I threw out a few ideas. Maybe software is terrible. Maybe developing software is hard. Maybe interacting with software is painful. Maybe painful software creates friction. Maybe friction gets between people and product. But really, that all adds up to this kind of shared idea that software should feel easy to everyone, and the software should get out of the way. So I went and took a look at how GitHub as a company thinks about these sort of problems, right? So the stated goal of GitHub, the product, right, is that it's to help people design, build, and ship software better together. And so in that sort of vein, I thought about it, and I decided that my principle for kind of continuing on Boxen work and continuing to make that better is that I want to help people more easily design, build, and ship things with software, right? And that oftentimes involves a lot of this, a lot of porcelain, right? There's going to be some really nasty guts underneath it, but you need to make a nicer interface so that people are willing to interact with it, so it's not painful to them, right? So we're going to need to make all this porcelain to help people ship. And before we understand like what the concept of shipping is, I want to go ahead and take a step back and say that shipping isn't just for software, right? Think about everyone in your organization, right? Your HR lady, she ships a new healthcare policy. Your legal team ships, a new, DMCA takedown or whatever they do to keep you out of getting into trouble, right? These are all ships, and we need to treat them equally. We can't just treat it as a software and design problem. And I want you to also to consider how your culture encourages those people thinking about ships in the same way that we do, where you ship early, ship often, where you iterate, where it doesn't have to be perfect the first time, but you keep working at it and making it better. So you want to enable ship it squirrels, right? So how are we going to do that? How are we going to get there? Well, I did the typical thing. I looked it up in a business book. It said, we need a mission statement. So I decided to think back to all the conference talks that I'd been to in the past 5 years or so. And there's this talk that always stood out to me by a guy named Brian Lyles. He's kind of big in the Ruby community. He did this talk called Test All the Fucking Time, right? And it was kind of about this idea that spiking code and making a proof of concept is very important. But at the same time, you need to be able to throw that spike away and go back to your principles of using test-driven development to go ahead and inform your design. Right? And he also wrote a blog post about the same idea before he started doing this talk series. And this quote always stuck with me. Right? It's the basic principle behind all software testing. Right? If we really boil this down, it's you write tests because you're going to come back to that code again someday, and you don't want it to be hard when you do. And other people are going to come across that code, and you don't want it to be hard for them either. It's about making it easier for everyone, right? So I had a brilliant idea, and I said, I'm going to do what all great artists do, and I'm going to rip it off. So if we change a few words around, we get something like this, right? So this is the core of like what automation is about. It's about making problems reproducibly solvable and easier for everyone, not just for yourself. So if we go ahead and boil that down to like its essence, we can figure out sort of what our mission statement is going to look like. So let's take those words. We got some caveman speak up there. Automate problem, reproduce solution. So let's add a few more words in there. Let's make it make a little bit more sense. So we can say automating solutions to problem leads to reproducible solutions. We're starting to get closer to English. But why are reproducible solutions important? Because they're easier than solving problems uniquely each and every time. They're consistent. You can solve them the same way every time, and you get a solution that is equally good every single time. And it is something that's for everyone. It's not just for yourself. It's going to benefit you, yes, but it's going to benefit everyone else down the line too. So I decided my mission statement is going to be automate all the fucking things. So let's go back to how we do that, right? What is this going to achieve? How are we going to use this principle and this mission statement to sort of guide how we're going to tackle these problems? Well, shippers work in environments, right? all sorts of different environments. Some of those environments might, for example, be Ruby in a database, right? That's a pretty simple environment. We see that one a lot. But maybe we have people who write documentation. We've definitely got people who feel their infrastructure needs to be like a rocket ship, right? With a million components that are all complex, and eventually the rocket ship maybe gets somewhere. We'll find out. And other times, it's closer to simple tooling, right? Very simple, like Bash. Like there are entire people at GitHub who all they do is work in Bash every day. I think that's awesome. So if we think about these environments, maybe you could have a holistic environment for a company. Maybe you only have one thing that you're working on. An environment looks like this, right? Maybe you've got some Clojure, you've got some Go, you've got some Ruby, Node.js, what have you. But maybe we start thinking about environments at a higher level, right? There are people inside GitHub who don't work in Rails. There are people who do work in Rails. And if we start thinking about environments not as there's one environment for all developers, but as many environments for many different kinds of developers, right? We can start flavoring the direction in which we choose to automate to solve problems to better suit a higher level abstraction. So maybe we have an environment for Rails, maybe we have an environment for web scale, maybe we have an environment for hipster stack, right? Maybe we have an environment for designers, right? Well, I don't even know how you fill this out. Ask yourselves, do you, right? How does your typical design in your company work? You could maybe say Photoshop or the name of a couple applications, but those are tools. That doesn't describe a workflow. How do you build an environment that enables a workflow for them, right? How do you do the same thing with your legal team? How do you do that for HR, right? Well, that's all I could come up with. There's hugs. And hugs are important, yes, but at the same time, that's not a workflow for them. That's just a really cool tool. Hugs are awesome. And what that made me think about was that we know a lot about how you build a developer's environment, right? How you build something that developers can use to get things done. We know about that workflow because we're in it every day. We understand it. We dog food it constantly. But we don't know what these people are working in. We don't know what their workflows are. We don't understand them. And oftentimes, we honestly look down on them, which I think is a little bit short-sighted and a whole lot of it arrogant, right? Because it's not that. So in GitHub, we talk about this a lot. There's this term, non-technical, that gets thrown around. I hate this term. I hate this term so much because when you really think about it, they're not non-technical. They have very technical skills that are applied in a different area. And sometimes that gets us thinking a little bit too high-minded about it, right? We get our own ivory tower and we're like, well, that's technical, yes, but you're really non-technical if you think about your role, and that's bullshit, right? I cannot do what our lawyer can do. I cannot do what our HR lady can do, as much as I might want to think otherwise. So we need to think about how we can enable these people to do the work that they do in a workflow that is as pleasant as the sort of workflow that we've started to build for ourselves, right? We need to understand those environments, and then we can make them better with automation. And the thing that I think that's most important to consider when we talk about that goal of automating their environments and making them more reproducible and more pleasant at the same time is that saying that they should use our tools is also a cop-out. As it turns out, our tools aren't great for everybody, right? Imagine trying to tell someone that you should use Git even to write every piece of documentation you're ever going to write. You know what Git's not good at? All sorts of things. It's not good at large storage. It's not good at doing prose diffs inline. These are problems that our tools just aren't capable of solving. And too often the solution we run towards really is, well, you need to change your workflow to adapt to the tools. And that's not really what it's about. It's about finding tools that enable a better workflow, right? So what else do shippers work on? They work on all sorts of projects, right? So for example, say we have a project like GitHub. It's a very complex project, all sorts of things flying about. It's a long-lived piece of software, right? Therefore, it's built up all its crufty little corners and all the things that no one really wants to think about as you know, sort of terrible problems that we've introduced, but they're there. And maybe we have some code that can solve that problem. And it looks like this. We try to simplify it a lot at a really higher level, and I think we've done a pretty good job of this, right? Now, this is our specific implementation. Other people have similar things, but at a high level, you can say things like, MySQL, yes, I need that. Redis, yes, I need that. Ruby, I need this version. We've achieved that. I think we've done a pretty good job there. And you can run a command like this, and at some point down the stack, there's going to be lots of computering going on inside. I don't know how it works. Most people don't either. And Jill developer can go ahead and work on GitHub the project. It's a pretty cool concept. But again, let's go back to everyone else that operates sort of in our environment, in our ecosystem that enables our business to function, right? Do we have stuff like this? Where's the automation for someone to build their quarterly finance report? Where is it if the finance team needs to go ahead and do your taxes or do a financial audit? How are we thinking about those problems? Right? I think it's really easy to say, well, here's this tool, maybe it's Boxen, maybe it's something else, and maybe everyone gets a development environment that has some Ruby versions and they get some security settings, but that's not enabling their workflow. That's not enabling them to ship better. We need to recognize things like shippers need different things than us, and they need different workflows than us. We need to start thinking hard about those problems, because once I think we get to the level where we can abstract those problems in the same way that we've abstracted our own problems, we're going to arrive at a better level of abstraction for everyone. Because shippers deserve to be happy. Now, since you're all shippers here, and this is fun. I love these small rooms because people are never afraid to ask questions. So we're going to leave plenty of time for questions. But shippers really like presents. So what have I got to talk to you about today? What is sort of coming down the road, right, for Boxen? How am I thinking about these problems? How are we going to try to make things better for everyone? Well, this isn't going to help everyone necessarily in the way that I might like, but it is going to help a lot of people. I'm proud to announce we've got official, all of the modules out there that we use internally inside GitHub, of which all of them are open source, now support OS 10.9 Mavericks, which should be out in the next few weeks. Another cool bit about that is that there's no longer a manual Xcode installation required. For a lot of people who've never even heard of what the hell an Xcode is, this is going to help them a lot. Right? We have people who we have to explain, well, there's this Mac App Store, and you have to go in and this and all that, and it's complicated for a lot of people. What this looks like in Mavericks, and this is totally an invention by Apple. I can't take credit for this. I just talked to them and gave them feedback along the way. If you try to run any of the command line tools, there's shims installed inside of OS 10.9 now. If you try to run any of them without Xcode or the developer command line tools installed, you'll get a prompt like this that will let you just install Xcode automatically that way, rather than command line tools. One of the things that will start to help a lot more people, though, is that we're focusing on Hiera everywhere. All of the Boxen modules that we're updating now are Hiera first by design. And that's a good thing, right? For two reasons, I think. The first is that updating every module every time you want a newer version of X is a terrible, terrible workflow. And I'm sorry I did that to anyone who's using Boxen. That wasn't the goal initially. It was just the quickest thing that worked. The other thing is it fixes the problem of defaults, right? We have a lot of defaults because Boxen is an opinionated stack. And it's opinionated for the needs of GitHub in a lot of ways, and that's not the needs of everyone else. That's pretty cool. It allows us to do it without ugly hacks, but the thing that excites me most is there's no more forked modules, so people can run things on a different port. But especially that YAML changes are way easier than Puppet, right? How many people inside your organization are afraid of Puppet? How many? Like people like, no matter what team, how many of them even know what Puppet is, but once they know what it is, are afraid of it, are sure they're going to break something, not only for themselves, but maybe for someone else, right? These are the things that keep me up at night, because I want everyone to feel welcome to go ahead and personalize their machine in an automated way to enable their workflows better. And as it turns out, editing a YAML file is probably the most friendly thing you can offer to someone in this position. It's better than JSON. It's a hell of a lot better than editing Puppet code. One of the other things that people talk to me a lot about is Linux support. It's coming. It's actually in progress. It's not something, there's not going to be a flag day where suddenly there's Linux support one day where there wasn't the previous day. We've been doing it one module at a time, kind of subtly actually. A lot of that comes through with, for example, the Hiera changes we've been making. But if you'll notice, there are modules, even inside GitHub's production Puppet, that are now actually code shared entirely with Boxen. We run them in production, and they work well for some cases. The refactorings are actually pretty simple themselves to enable this to be possible. And if we have time at the end, I'd actually like to maybe go through one of those, as much of a Jinx as live coding is as an exercise. More of the core modules are going to get support over time. There's only a few left. The ones I can think about specifically that stand out to me: DNS mask, MySQL, Postgres, Redis. Work is going on to do those. We're trying to figure out how to make some things, like being able to run multiple instances of Redis server in the context of a service like, for example, initd, possible without repackaging the OS packages, because that's kind of terrible. We're still working on that. I think I have some ideas that'll get us there, and we certainly should discuss this in an open setting. We'll get there. The other thing I'm really excited about is Puppet Master support. People have talked about this a lot. Specifically, I've heard from organizations like Mozilla's engineering team looking to use Puppet Master in the context of their Boxen environment. And the funny thing is I actually wasn't involved in any of this, and that makes me really happy, sort of as someone who spent a long time working on this project and a long time making sure it was something that we could open source. Someone told me about it yesterday during the conference. It's really happy, like, to find out that someone is like contributing in such a major way like that. And I honestly, I'm a terrible human being. I forgot your name, but I just wanted to say, if you're here, good on you, and I definitely owe you a beer. Because that's major support, right? That's the whole point of open source, is getting major contributions in. And there's certainly other people I owe beers to as well. We'll cover them a little bit later. Menu bar app is also coming. And I feel really bad about this one because last year I had a really terrible proof of concept of how you could do a menu bar app that said there's updates available and you can run for updates and you can choose new modules to be installed in your configuration. Unfortunately, that hasn't progressed at all since last year. But I do have good news. And that is that one of my new roommates is actually one of our GitHub for Mac developers. So I'm actually been leaning on him a little bit, and I think I've got him really excited about this now. This is actually going to be pressing forward in an open source manner. And I think we're going to be able to get a menu bar out in the wild that's going to achieve a lot of these things before the end of the year, hopefully. So it's finally going to happen. The other thing we've been working on a lot, and I think is getting a lot closer, is this library called Henson. Now, a few times over the course of the conference, some of you have heard about a tool called Librarian Puppet, or maybe you already use Librarian Puppet. In either case, you should know it's not the greatest piece of software. And Tim, the author of it, will happily tell you the same thing. That's why he's co-writing Henson with me. Because Librarian Puppet works, sort of. And in reality, there's a whole lot of bugs, but the base implementation of Librarian Puppet is restricted by the library it's built on, which is called Librarian. It actually comes out of the Chef community, and it makes a lot of assumptions that aren't necessarily true for our use cases. And really, I just want to go ahead and offer a shout out to the Librarian developers, which is to say that your software is bad and you should feel bad. It's not extensible. It's not really a good library to base any sort of tooling off of in the context of environments that aren't Chef. And that isn't to say, like, for Chef, there are lots of good tools built upon it, but it's not a very good library if you can only use it in one environment. So I just want to say Henson is not a dead project, right? It's something that Rajek and I are still working on when we can find time. We have a lot of responsibilities to GitHub as a company to focus on its production needs. And when we get opportunities, we do hack on it. It is open source. It's at wfar/Henson, right? It's Ruby, standard lib only. There are no external dependencies. It's actually really close. We think probably a week or two of dedicated work could really get it there. There are only a few things missing, like local caching and log file support. Everything else thus far works. So again, some other priorities needed our attention first. We'd love your help on it, but we're certainly going to try to open source it as soon as, not open source it, get a 1.0 release as soon as we can. It's already open source. So that said, I said I want to leave some time for questions, so I just want to review a few closing thoughts, right? Some things that people ask me about all the time, right, is like, well, I wanted to use Boxen, but it was terrible, which is probably true for your use case. Or they ask me, why isn't Boxen better? That's a really loaded question, right? I just want to say, you know, Boxen's not perfect. And the reason it's not perfect is it can't be. It's software, right? I talked about yesterday, all software is terrible. I truly believe this. Boxen, most of all. Boxen is terrible, terrible software, but it occasionally manages to get things done, right? It's made our lives a lot easier at GitHub, and I'm really happy for that, and I'm really glad I spent time working on it for that reason. It might make your life easier, too. That's maybe why you should consider it. Certainly don't use it because there's a name attached, whether it's mine or GitHub's, John's. Do it, like, seriously, if you have to think about it, like, fuck me, right? Don't listen to me. Do it for you, right? Because you have an opportunity to make your organization better, your work better. You have an opportunity to maybe be happier. And maybe that's with Boxen, maybe that's with another tool. I don't care. As long as you're happier, that's really what matters. So take a look in the mirror, say, how can I make my life better, and make it happen. Thank you. Questions? Like, just go to the mic. Don't even bother, like, just make a queue, whatever, if anyone has any questions. If not, we can call it good. You guys got a few extra minutes to meander about. Yeah?
Why did you completely eschew Puppet's module file format and go your own route?
So we actually do intend to support the module file. So the Puppet file is only about expressing the dependencies that you want in terms of sort of high-level dependencies in the way that bundler does, right? So for example, rspec, I want this version. Now, rspec is actually, for example, composed of 4 gems, and rspec, the gem, handles the dependencies on those 4 gems. We have not implemented the transitive dependency model yet because we actually want this to be supported in the Puppet module tool itself in such a way that we can actually hook into the Puppet module tool directly rather than having to write our own implementation. Because the worst thing that could happen is that we actually have differing behavior between the Puppet module tool and between our tool. And this is kind of one of the things we're focusing on with Henson. And I'm actually really excited. There was a talk earlier in this conference where the Puppet module team has decided that Puppet module tool is again going to split out of Puppet core and be its own tool again, which allows them to iterate a little bit more quickly, not be dependent on Puppet versions in order to work. And I think we can get there pretty soon. I mean, I would certainly love to see us use whatever Puppet module tool is using to determine all of its information about what modules get installed and how, in which way, as much as we can. There's also been some rumblings, I can't confirm this, that the module file may in fact be going away and being replaced by a metadata.json file, in which case, hopefully as long as the module tool supports the sort of API that we need to interact with it, we'll be able to use that as well.
And one more, for those of us who actually have to go through corporate legal, could you guys please put license files in all your modules? Absolutely.
There's actually an open request on at least one of them.
Tickets, but you guys still have dozens of modules.
Absolutely. It's certainly on the radar, and I know it's not legally sound in any way, but I personally will guarantee you that every single one of those modules is going to be MIT licensed. We'll take care of that just as soon as we can. Anyone else? Cool. Well, if there are no other questions, I'll let you guys have an extra long break. And if you see me around the conference and you think of any other questions that you didn't have a chance to think of now, please do come up and talk to me. I'm happy to speak with you. Thank you.